All right, looks like we've got a good group joining us. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I have the pleasure of working with the Strata Center for Consumer Insights and will be your host today as we talk through the latest findings in Strata's Public Viewpoint survey. To date, Strata has now talked to over 16,000 Americans across the country since the pandemic hit. We've been following closely the impact of the global health crisis on Americans' work, their lives, and their plans for education. So today we're going to talk specifically at looking at Americans' preferences for short-term programs and online programs. These are trends that have been enduring throughout the survey, and so we'll let Andrew dig into that and share a little bit more about what we're learning. Following that, really excited for our discussion. We've got a great group of panelists today. We have Ryan Craig, Managing Director at Achieve Partners, Michael Macklin, Associate Vice Chancellor for Workforce Partnerships at the Colorado Community College System, and Vaughn Tonquinlivan, CEO of Futuro Health. So pretty quickly here, we'll jump into discussion, but first we'll hand it over to Andrew for a presentation of the findings.
Well, thank you, Jenna, and on behalf of Strata, thank you all for joining us today. As part of our partnership with Inside Higher Ed to elevate the voices of learners and the broader American public to higher education leaders, a couple of weeks ago, IHE profiled 8 learners, and Felicia Cannon, you see here, was among them. And her story really highlights what we're going to talk about today. Like many high school grads, Felicia started out enrolled at a 4-year college in her home state of Texas, majoring in psychology. But pretty early on, she decided that the debt that she would have had to take on was just too risky, and she really wasn't sure what she wanted to do with her life. So she worked night shift as a Quick Trip as an assistant manager for 8 years while she was sampling classes at her local community college. And then a few years ago, she started working at an Amazon fulfillment center, lifting heavy packages for several hours at a time. And through that job, she discovered Amazon's Career Choice program, which pays 95% of tuition for programs that prepare you for in-demand jobs in the region that aren't necessarily at Amazon. And through that program, she was able to take courses at Coursera and through Google with support services through the nonprofit Merit America. And as of July, she was able to get a job at a software and education company that pays substantially more than she earned at Amazon and allows her to work from home in the midst of this pandemic. And in the interview, she really spoke to how that experience instilled this confidence in herself. She said, "I was so unsure of myself before. There was a part of me that I didn't think that I could be successful, but now I want to go as high as I can go." And so it's now been 5 months. So again, it's now been 5 months since we began fielding the Public Viewpoint survey. We now have more than 16,000 Americans in our database since the beginning of the pandemic. And what we found through this work is that there are millions of Americans who are just like Felicia, who are looking for different pathways, non-traditional pathways into good jobs. And since May, we've seen that Americans have expressed a consistent interest in education and training, with around 1 in 5 saying that they plan to enroll in an education or training program within the next 6 months. And since April, we've been asking them what kind of education they would prefer if they enrolled in the next 6 months. Would they prefer a degree program, like a graduate degree, a bachelor's degree, or an associate's degree, or a non-degree option, like a certificate program, or just select courses to develop their skills or for personal development? And the majority, 62%, have said that they'd prefer that skills training or non-degree program, with 37% specifically saying that they'd prefer skills-based training over the alternatives, another 25% saying they'd prefer a non-degree credential. And so as Jenna mentioned, this week we wanted to understand why. What are the reasons that are motivating these preferences? And so we asked this: how important are the following reasons for your preference for whatever option you prefer over the alternatives? How important is it that it's a better value, that it's more affordable, that it's more convenient, or that it's required in your field of work? And we asked respondents to tell us what was the most important reason first, and then for the others, tell us, is it very important, somewhat important, or not important at all? And we rolled up those 4 categories, those 9 reasons, into the 4 categories that you see here. Value, how streamlined the option is, how relevant it is to their personal and professional needs, and then how stackable it is, meaning that it would lead to further education and training down the road. And what we did then was look at this in 2 different ways. The first way, which you see here, is looking only at what respondents said was the most important factor in deciding between degree and non-degree options. And what you can see is that relevance, is it required, or does it apply to my work? Does it fit my personal needs? Is the most common chief motivator. And then after relevance, how streamlined the option is, meaning how fast, affordable, and convenient it was. That was the second most common chief motivator. And then the second way that we looked at this was in terms of the average rating for the particular reason, from ranging again from most important to not at all important. And we compared those who preferred non-degree education options to those who preferred degree programs. And what we found was that there was a lot of overlap between those who preferred degree and non-degree options in terms of both rated the relevance and value among their highest rated reasons. The difference was that those who preferred non-degree and skills training options thought it was a better value proposition than the alternatives, while those who preferred degree programs said, hey, I really need a degree in order to achieve my personal and professional goals. One interesting variation that we saw was that overall stackability wasn't rated as very important. For Americans with a high school education or less, it was actually ranked second in terms of average importance. So these Americans who have less education, they uniquely want to know how their next education opportunity connects to further education down the road. So then another trend that we've seen, which we highlighted in last month's public viewpoint, is this preference for online only and hybrid modes of learning, with only 25% of Americans saying, if they were to pursue education and training in the next 6 months, that they would go in person. But then we also, when we asked them, well, what would your preference be, if COVID weren't a factor, we saw an enduring interest in online learning even beyond the pandemic. And so in addition to better understanding why Americans prefer degree versus non-degree options, we also wanted to understand what's motivating their preferences for different modes of education, comparing in-person, hybrid, and online. And so similar to our approach to understanding individuals' preferences with respect to degree versus non-degree, we asked respondents with respect to your preference for in-person versus hybrid versus online only, how important are the following reasons for that preference? And here we included things like safety, convenience, which mode helps you learn most effectively, and which is most affordable. And again, we asked respondents, tell us what's the most important reason, and then for the others, is it very important, somewhat important, or not important at all? And here, looking at the most important reasons overall, what we see is that safety is the most important factor for 35% of Americans. And then right after that are comfort and support on the one hand, and then convenience. And perhaps surprisingly, Americans say that their preference for which mode they would pursue, that's not chiefly motivated by which mode helps them learn most effectively. And then, again, in addition to what was most important, we also looked at how the Americans' average ratings for the importance of these different factors. And we compared those who preferred in-person education to those who preferred hybrid and online. And on this measure, those who preferred online only said their top 3 reasons were safety, convenience, and affordability, while those who preferred in-person rated which mode helped them learn most effectively, number 1, and then comfort and support second. We saw 2 interesting demographic variations here. First, Americans without college degrees were substantially more likely to identify comfort and support as the most important factor for their preference, which buttresses one of our recent findings about a month and a half ago, that for less educated Americans, self-doubt is one of the primary barriers to further education. And then second, we compared to middle and high income Americans, low income Americans were more likely to say that the most important factor for their preference was convenience, and they were less likely to say that it's most important which mode helps them learn most effectively. And so again, what we've seen more broadly is that with working adults, especially low-income adults, that the need to understand how they'll be able to fit their learning into their other life's commitments, chiefly work and family, is of utmost importance. And so as always, I want to encourage you to visit our Public Viewpoint webpage at strataeducation.org/public viewpoint, where you can download this deck and related materials. You can explore these data yourself. And please email us at consumervoice@strataeducation.org if you have any questions or feedback. But let me offer a few concluding thoughts before we jump into the panel discussion. I think what this data really speaks to is the need for learning options that are designed specifically for working adults who are looking to reskill and upskill, in many cases, because their work and learning has been disrupted by the pandemic. For decades, we paid lip service to this notion of lifelong learning, but we're really only beginning to build the systems, the infrastructure, and the architecture to facilitate that learning. Our learning ecosystem is still very much designed for education at the front end of your life. This pandemic has had, I think, a profound impact on workers, on students, on learning providers, and it's also raised the question of whether long-term structural changes that we've been observing over the past decade or more, such as a shift to learning models that are more unbundled or more virtual, let's say, whether those changes will accelerate. And so as we navigate this crisis and its impact on higher education, it's absolutely essential to continue to understand education consumers. What are their preferences, their plans, motivations, and barriers, and so on, so that we can design learning experiences that are going to meet them where they are and then move them to where they want to go, as well as for learning providers to just better understand how they can attract and then retain these learners. And so through the Public Viewpoint, what we're seeing is millions of working learners whose work and education has been disrupted and who, like Felicia, think that price tag on degree programs is too high, or they just aren't sure that it will be worth it or that they could fit it into their life. And so in the end, what they're looking for is learning that's, as we've seen, personalized, streamlined, and career-oriented, or in other words, they're asking us to treat them like consumers. And so with that, thank you. And Jenna, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And we put the deck in the chat, so if you want to look it up or reference anything, please do so. We'll also send that back around to everyone tomorrow with a recap from today's conversation. So know that you'll have access to the deck, and you can certainly go back to that as we talk. One last thing before I jump into questions. Q&A is at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to drop questions in there. You can also use the chat, but we will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll get to your questions in just a minute here. But first, I'd like to start with Vaughn and Michael, who are serving learners today. Let's hear a little bit about your organizations and how short-term programs are showing up for you. Vaughn, let's start with you. So the pandemic's created an urgent need to both reskill healthcare professionals in fields like telehealth, but also quickly train up individuals for new roles like contact tracing. I'd love to hear how you've approached the rapid development of new programs, and for jobs that we hope are short-term, like contact tracers, how are you thinking about the shelf life of those credentials, and how are you preparing individuals for longer-term career progression? We will unmute you. There we go.
Oh, that would help. All right, very good. So Jenna, certainly the pandemic is driving Andrew's point home very clearly. We're not just challenged to keep up with the pace of business, which has been our traditional mantra in higher education, but nowadays it's really how do you keep up with the pace of change, the rate of change. So Futuro Health is my organization. We were a nonprofit established in January of this year through a $130 million commitment by Kaiser Permanente and the United Healthcare Workers. And it's really addressing the shortage of allied health workers in the nation. So allied health workers are trained through more than a high school degree, but less than a bachelor's degree. So let me just give you a case in point. 3 months ago, telehealth was just sort of a whisper on the fringe of healthcare. And yet today, a few months later, it's all about telehealth, right? Because of the concerns of patients for safety. And so what we had to do was to scramble for relevance, to ensure that the training is relevant. We scoured the country looking for who has a telehealth certificate that can be helpful to upskill current workers so that their roles can consider how do you deliver health services via telehealth. And it took us to University of Delaware, where they had a 15-week, fully online, adult-friendly, self-paced program that was established. They were gated by just being able to do 3 cohorts of 30, so basically a throughput of 90 per semester, which wasn't enough. And so we had a lot of conversations on building the capacity, and now they can take 1,000 students at a time in order to upskill really across all of America. Every health center, every hospital has to now perform the telehealth function, not just from the clinician side, but also the IT people supporting telehealth and the operations people supporting telehealth. All of a sudden your job, the nature of your job has changed. And so it's a big scramble to go find this upskilling that's available. So this ability to quickly source and curate and being able to even evolve the curriculum will be, I think, a key success factor for our workforce. And if they're able to access these credentials, that would help them stay relevant in the workforce as things are changing extremely fast right now.
Thank you. We'll come back to that a little bit as we get into our discussion. Michael, your system's online programs are expecting about a 25% increase in enrollment this fall, which I think reflects some of the data that we're seeing today. Can you speak to what do you know about what's motivating new learners that are enrolling at your institution? And then how are you thinking about short-term programs that set learners up for a longer-term academic and career journey?
Yeah, so I think there's a handful of things that are motivating our students. And when we talk about our students, our system is a system of 13 colleges. We serve about 120,000 students across the state of Colorado in about 40 different locations. So we do have quite a reach when it comes to the state of Colorado. And we've been that workforce driver and that economic driver for a long time in these local communities. I think what we're seeing is individuals trying to come back to us for a couple of reasons. So these are maybe individuals who are sitting out of their 4-year program for a year. These may be individuals who are looking for some rapid upskilling, and I'll talk about skills builders here later on in the conversation. But I think it's worth highlighting too. I think a lot of the conversation is focused on, how do we quickly respond, and what does the recovery look like, and what is the role of institutions of higher ed in that? And one of the things that we did take a look at was, during the last recession, and recognizing that pandemics and recessions are different, it took about 18 months for our enrollment to spike and to see that kind of counter-cyclical notion that enrollment increases in economic downturn. So I just thought that was a relevant part of the conversation as we start thinking about responding. And I think another point I wanted to highlight, I see a lot of conversations and threads and things about short-term credentials versus degrees, short-term credentials versus academic programs. And I think for the examples I'm going to give here briefly, I want to shift that narrative a little bit. And so I want to say short-term credentials and post-secondary degrees and post-secondary certificates. The examples that I've highlighted or will highlight here shortly are going to show that you can have a short-term credential that may be non-credit or maybe non-traditional that stacks into these post-secondary credentials, much like we were seeing in Andrew's presentation. So the ones I want to highlight, and I would have loved to highlight one from all 13, but that would have taken up all of our time plus. So a couple of accelerated programs that kind of highlight what Andrew's data was supporting. So one is Arapahoe Community College. So in partnership with a healthcare provider, they took an 18-month medical assisting program and condensed that into a 75% non-credit competency-based online course. And then the remaining 25% happens in a lab, and they are receiving on-the-job training as they're going through this program. So what that showed to the employer is a willingness to respond. And for the student, they're earning a living, and they're actually earning 3 certificates by the end of this. So they're earning a USDOL apprenticeship certificate, certification through NHA, and then a post-secondary credential through Arapahoe Community College, all while kind of unbundling this non-credit coursework and then bundling it back into our post-secondary credentials. The second one I want to highlight is with the Community College of Aurora. And I think that one of the cornerstones of the community colleges is our direct relationship with employers and how we really try to partner and make our curriculum relevant to their needs. And so this was some direct feedback from the Denver Metro Tech Sector Partnership in partnership with Perrin and Community College of Aurora. What they did is they identified an opportunity to accelerate a traditional IT program. So this was traditionally 22 academic credits spread out over kind of a traditional academic cadence. The new Get IT program consolidated 22 academic credits into 16 weeks that resulted in industry recognized credential, the CompTIA A+. But again, with that eye towards and versus either or, this all stacks into the applied associates in science and computer information science. So again, with that eye of trying to scale these into additional pathways for individuals versus kind of one-way cul-de-sacs for our learners.
Thanks, Michael. And I heard unbundling. We'll get to that in a minute in more detail. But Ryan, you wrote the book on the rise of faster, cheaper post-secondary programs, and I actually see the book right over your shoulder. So let's talk about what you saw in the book. But even the data today suggests that demand is accelerating both for short-term programs, but also online. But I know in talking with you, you have some skepticism as to whether both of those trends are here to stay. So here, tell us a little bit about what you're observing in this unique moment.
Yeah, well, let me talk about short-term programs first. I wrote in the book about what I consider to be the single most important change in post-secondary education over the past 20, 25 years, which is the rise of the employment imperative, which is 20 years ago, if you'd surveyed individuals who were matriculating into a degree program at an American university and you asked them why they were doing it, about 50% would have said it was for reasons related to job or income or career, and 50% would have given you other reasons. And today, when you ask that question, or before COVID, when you ask that question, it was consistently 92, 93%. It was about job. It was about employment. That's why individuals enroll in degree programs. And I think COVID simply supercharges that employment imperative. And unfortunately, very few universities have built an employment or employer-focused brand sufficiently strong that prospective students think, I want to, or I need to earn a degree from this institution for the express purpose of getting a good first job. Now, there are lots of reasons for this: the nature of academic institutions, how career services operates, and primarily how the world of work and hiring has been transformed by digital technology, and higher ed just simply hasn't kept up. So there is this long-term trend, an increased demand for faster and cheaper alternative pathways to good jobs, and it's a trend that has been now been dramatically accelerated by COVID. If we take elite institutions, say the top 50, out of the equation, because demand will always be high and largely unchanged for the degree programs that they operate, I would go as far as to say that demand for degree programs at less selective or non-selective universities will be increasingly correlated with the percentage of the population in good jobs, already in good jobs, seeking better jobs. That is to say, earning a degree is almost a luxury, rather than the percentage of the population unemployed or underemployed seeking good jobs. That is to say, an emergency. Because if you have an urgent or emergent need to earn a job, to get a good job, you are increasingly less likely to want to enroll in a degree program, to invest tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years of your life for the hope of having a chance to get a good job. That's not a viable value proposition anymore. Now, as Michael indicated, it doesn't always have to be or. It could be an and. And I've written about upside down degree programs like BYU Pathway Worldwide, which has which makes sure that students in their first year of their bachelor's degree program earn 2 industry recognized certificates, and then they go on to complete the degree. You can integrate digital credentials, with platforms like Credly as part of your degree program. You can integrate work experience into coursework in degree programs via platforms like Ripen, or it could be through partnerships with these fast-growing last-mile apprenticeship programs like Talent Path or Optimum Healthcare IT that hire and train new graduates right on campus. But the status quo is not sustainable for non-selective universities that only plan to offer multi-year degree programs. So I think that's my view on sort of the short-term or faster and cheaper pathways. In terms of online, I think that the sort of digital cognoscenti or pundits out there who are projecting that finally we're seeing the disruption of higher ed because now everyone's online, they're wrong about that. I think as soon as we can get back to campus safely, we will. And that the current sort of remote learning boom is not a long-term trend. I think that there's no question that online learning will increasingly be the modality of choice for those who are in a good job looking to upskill to a better job, but the pathway from high school or not in a good job to the first rung of a career ladder in a dynamic sector of the economy will remain firmly on ground.
And if I could just add on to that, Jenna, just what we've seen with the public viewpoint, is exactly that, Ryan, that for Gen Z, that 18 to 24-year-old college-going population really have a much stronger preference for in-person. They want to go back to school. That early socialization experience is top of mind and connected to the value of education more so than the adult learners who are just seeking that skills component.
Yeah, well, and that brings maybe to a follow-up question, Ryan. When you think about the unbundling of higher ed, we saw the push to remote, right? Institutions were forced, right, to strip down to just instruction. And I think we'd all agree that on this group that remote is not synonymous with online instruction by any means. But I'm curious, from your perspective, even if we do go back, when we do go back to an in-person modality, will you see, even on the traditional side, do you expect to see more unbundling of what the traditional degree experience looks like?
I think there's going to be a lot of pressure. I mean, there's no question. You've got a bunch of angry consumers out there who are paying full price. They're paying a bundled price for a product that is not a bundle at all. It is a series of online courses that they're taking without any of the benefits of being on campus, any of the amenities or supplemental services that they pay for as part of their tuition and fees. So I think you're going to have an increasing percentage of the student population pushing universities to unbundle. I think they're going to come back to campus, but they're going to say, why do we have to pay for sports? I saw there was a petition going around somewhere where you're essentially urging universities to unbundle the price of athletics from tuition and fees. So I think we're going to see more of that. It's now the tuition and fees bundle has become bared and obvious to people.
Michael, maybe I'd like to go back to some of your opening remarks, perhaps different aspect of the unbundling conversation, but you also talked about rethinking some of your existing short-term programs, right, and accelerating those for this moment in time. How are you, talk us through a little bit of that process.
Yeah, so kind of to Ryan's points, I think that we are working on quite a few things around business engagement and those relationships with businesses and being really responsive. I think that when it comes to unbundling at an institutional level, the students are doing it for us. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight was a population of students that we refer to as skills builders. And so these students usually have a post-secondary credential. So they've already got one in hand. They join us for about a semester and they leave because of the income trajectory that course or series of courses put them on. So there's no formality around these individuals in the structure of go take these 2 courses and you'll get this. These are students who are identifying for themselves a career trajectory and unbundling our curriculum for us for employment. I think that our opportunity in that is how do we capitalize on finding those paths that those individuals are choosing on their own and putting them in touch with those employers, making those hiring decisions. So I think we've got that opportunity. And again, the students are doing it for us. It's just us that need to figure out how to catalyze that and propel them onto that path.
And Vaughn, I mean, that's really what you guys have been doing at Futuro as well. And even as we were talking, you were talking about the telehealth program, right? And all of a sudden thinking about, okay, what are the different components that make a really compelling program? Maybe talk us through that. And perhaps you can even just share a little bit about the founding thesis behind Futuro.
So I want to make it clear, the bundled education, higher education, never really worked quite well for adults in the first place. It didn't serve adults in the first place. So I think there's a moment in time right now where we can design different bundles for how do you get adults into those their entry roles and move them up, in terms of social mobility. So let me just give you an example of how we're pulling together an ecosystem of different education partners, and then I would explain it in a sense of Legoing different things together so that it's supportive of the student journey for an adult. So for example, Michael mentioned the medical assistant, which is a gateway occupation in healthcare. It's roughly an 11-month program. So what we've done is we've lined up 6 higher education providers. And if a student has taken anatomy, physiology, and medical terminology, we pass them straight into that, we ramp them straight into that program. If they haven't, one of these 6 institutions now plays the point of offering those jumpstart courses, and we pathway everybody into that one institution, and then from there, they fan out into the 6. And then we've also have a 3rd set of Legos. So if you're not feeling confident about your English, we offer you English readiness for allied health, starting with Spanish speakers, so that you can start in that pathway, build your confidence for the education pathway. So in each of these, we're working with different education partners, and then depending on whether that education partner has a lot of student support or little student support, we begin coupling student supports to the education provider for that part of the student journey. And then there's another part. We then couple in much more emphasis, a whole curriculum around soft skills development. What Strata calls it human plus skills. We're calling it human touch healthcare, because we've also heard that employers were not satisfied with students coming out with that set of skill sets, which, as you can imagine, in healthcare is particularly important. So again, if you think about unbundling all of these elements, right, the student support, the technical training, the soft skills training, the mentorship, the financial aid, like these are all components of higher education that never quite came together well for adults. How do you bring them back in a way that is more responsive to an adult learning journey to get to their credential and then get more credential over time?
Great, that's very helpful. I'm going to jump to some of the audience questions because we've got a number of them. I might come back to a few other questions talking through, but let's start with this topic of who pays, right? So we have a few questions here. I'll try my best to kind of synthesize them as we go. But we have a few questions around, if students aren't enrolling in terminal degrees, what are the financial aid options? And we have another question here that just says, are older students getting less aid than their traditional age peers? How are we thinking about helping students finance their education? So maybe Vaughn, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the recognition that our traditional model has been one where you have as much education as you can up front, usually in the form of a degree. But the reality is that it's not just a one-time inoculation, but a set of booster shots throughout your life, right? And in terms of who pays, it's usually a combination of public, employer, and then you as the individual. Well, we know that we could barely, as a country, afford the upfront inoculation with financial aid being so strapped. Now that we all are required to do all these skills boosters, these booster shots, and we're not with our employers very long, whether we're, we have shrunken tenures of 5 years or less, according to the Department of Labor, or we're working multiple gigs, it is really problematic to have things coupled to the employer. So then it comes back to the individual having to pay. And I think this is where we really have to work on figuring out some new social structures, some new financing, so that individuals can actually do the reality of having all these upskillings throughout their life.
Michael, anything you'd want to add there?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I would highlight is I think that business needs to play a larger role in what these relationships look like, and then especially in the financing of this type of education. When we look on the non-credit side of the house and of different institutions, there's very little funding available for these. These are usually auxiliary units that are funded by revenue. And unfortunately, that revenue often falls to the learner. And so I think that if we shift the narrative from having business as consumers of the educational system, but being partners in kind of co-creation of talent development, we can shift that to where businesses are investing in the learners we're putting through, because ultimately they know they're going to hire those individuals. So I do think that especially in the short-term credential space, intentional partnerships and investment from business is critical for the financing of it.
And Ryan, you've been investing in kind of the employer model for a long time now. Talk to us about what you see as some of the most kind of compelling models there.
Well, look, I mean, I think when I wrote the book Over My Shoulder, it was a couple of years ago, and it was sort of laying out this whole universe of last mile training programs, beginning with tuition paying boot camps and evolving to income share programs where students aren't being asked to take the financial risk. They're signing a contract where they'll repay if and when it pays off for them. And also the emergence of these sort of new apprenticeship programs. And I think that the conclusion we came to from really trial and error and looking at which of these models were growing fastest was that, and perhaps obviously in retrospect, the ones that grow fastest and scale the furthest are the ones with the least friction built into the equation. And so that's both friction for the student or candidate and friction for the employer. So friction for the student or candidate is the cost of upskilling, right? And the uncertainty of the employment outcome, right? If you could somehow reduce or eliminate those frictions, you'd have a lot more people going out and getting the skills that employers are looking for. But there's an equal and opposing friction on the employer side, hiring friction, which is the reduced propensity of employers to hire candidates for entry-level roles where they literally haven't checked every box. And that's the direct byproduct of three things: digital hiring. We can get into that, what that means. Second is the increased cost of a bad hire, which in some cases, if you make a big mistake, it can cost you, 6 figures in some cases. And the third is increased churn at the entry level. 50% of new college grads going into a good job are gone out of those jobs within 2 years. So most employers have gotten out of the business of entry level training. They want the perfect candidate served up on a silver platter, or they just simply don't hire. And so, the models that we like, the models that we're investing behind now are the ones that not only reduce those frictions, but eliminate them completely with these apprenticeship models where you hire from day one, you train and often custom train for specific employers and then act as the employer of record for a period of time, allowing the ultimate employer, the client, to try before they buy the talent. And we found that you can scale to thousands annually within a very short period of time, as opposed to these sort of legacy last mile models that charge tuition or even require income share, but that don't guarantee any employment outcomes. So those are the ones we're focused on. And, frankly, I do believe that in 5 years, we're going to see hundreds of these models across the country, and they will give many non-selective colleges and universities a run for their money. If you can imagine a market, Denver, for example, where you've got 12 or to 20 new pathways offering guaranteed jobs and training into areas like cybersecurity, Salesforce, data science and analytics, various allied health professions, and compare that value proposition to enrolling and taking on debt to earn a degree at a non-selective university. I think you're going to see a shift in consumer behavior. And as I've said before, I'm not suggesting that less post-secondary education in aggregate or per capita is advisable or plausible in the global knowledge economy. That's economic suicide. But what I am suggesting is that we're going to see a restaging in how we consume post-secondary education, from all you can eat in one sitting, which is the current bundled degree model, to what we need when we need it. And of course, there's a word for that, which is lifelong learning. The big difference is, and that's, everyone's in favor of that. The big difference is that everyone in higher education has always assumed that lifelong learning would be degree and, right, stacked on top of the degree. And that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be, for many, if not most people, a faster and cheaper pathway to a good first job, getting your foot on the first rung of a career ladder, looking around with no debt, working for a couple of years, getting more information, and then ascertaining what secondary or tertiary pathway you're going to pursue to move on, move up, progress your career. And that it will be those secondary and tertiary pathways where you'll be building those cognitive skills, critical thinking skills, executive function skills, critical thinking that ostensibly are being built today in bachelor's degree programs.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's go back to one of the findings around motivation. I'm seeing a number of questions around this idea of stackability. So Linda Hess here has a question. I found it interesting that the respondents did not indicate stackability had much importance, but we in higher ed are always looking at stacking credentials. And there's a few other kind of comments and questions around whether that, individuals actually understand the concept of stackability, if it's a less structured, construct here in the US versus in other places. So maybe Andrew, if you want to start, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. I know that was something that stood out to all of us as we were looking at the research early on.
And talking, through the findings initially with some of our colleagues here and outside of Strata, I think many of us were surprised that stackability was even as high as it was, because our hypothesis is that consumers are thinking short term, as Ryan said, that get the education I need to get that next job, that are whatever it's trying to advance your career, or you're trying to get an entry level job in a new field, that is likely how they're sort of their motivations are sort of organized. The challenge is when you come back, right, and you want to get credit for what you've already learned, that's when sort of stackability becomes important. So not to say that it's not necessarily important, but it is not necessarily a chief driver if you want to reach consumers, if you want to figure out how to attract and retain them. That's going to play less importance, but not to say that it's not worth pursuing.
Yeah, Michael, you kind of alluded to this already, but you're thinking that through. How do we meet consumers where they're at and think about, they're already kind of figuring out some of their own pathways. So how do you ensure that when they do come back, that can be more of a pathway and a more stackable credential? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I ultimately think it's our responsibility to provide those paths for individuals. I don't think that they are coming into our institutions thinking 6-7 steps down the road. But to Ryan's point, making sure that when they do come back and think of step 2, step 3, that those frictions are removed. And so in Colorado, we're doing a lot of work on prior learning assessment. There's even some legislation that was passed last year that really kind of helps propel some of that work to where we're looking at what can work experience translate to in post-secondary credit. But again, the students are not necessarily asking for that, and it's indicated by the data that they're not even necessarily thinking of that. But when they do think about it, we need to make sure that we've got processes and procedures in place to allow for that progression.
Vaughn or Ryan, anything you want to add there before we go into the next questions? Oh, Vaughn, you're muted.
Stackability is really important when you think about a sort of systematic approach to enlarging the talent pool. So if you're dealing with a talent puddle, for example, we're going to have a lot more mental health issues in the future, and most of that talent pool is trained at the master's level. And there is a feeder pool, but those are, for example, licensed vocational nurses, licensed practical nurses. They were trained at the associate level. So the question of stackability is like, how do you accelerate the design between somebody that has maybe a 2-year and get them all to the master's level in order to get a talent pool, but not take the traditional amount of time and then have also people step off from work to be able to do that. Starting from scratch is very discouraging, and I'm glad Michael brought up the prior learning assessment. Having some prior learning assessment so that you can sort of advance place really helps with completion and persistence amongst adults. So the more that on the backside, all of us are designing for stack, it will help with addressing sort of systemic shortages in talent pools.
And maybe as a follow-on, thinking about the consumer, the student, there's a question here that just kind of remarks, this is all very complicated. How do we explain these multiple options to students when we're talking about all these bits and pieces? The old degree model perhaps was kind of simple and made sense. So how do we make sure that individuals understand what kinds of options are available? Michael, you want to take that?
I was considering that almost rhetorical because I think it's a really difficult question, right? But I think we've got some cues in higher education that we can pull from private industry. And I think that when we think of if you're thinking of learners as consumers of education, think of yourself as a consumer with Amazon, any of these others. What are they doing in kind of the customer life cycle that makes it easy for you to acquire what you want when you want it? And so I think we can take some cues from private industry. I don't have the answers to it, and I don't suspect that many institutions of higher education do, but I think that where we can see some value is really taking those cues from private industry and seeing how we can propel people on a path towards acquisition of skills and abilities that they're looking for when they want it.
Yeah, I look at it from where is the labor market need? Where's the opportunity for the individual? And then what can we do, to Ryan's point, of removing the friction? So interestingly enough, the Futuro Health model was actually workers in this form. The labor unions decided to forego cost of living adjustment in order to put the funds into this nonprofit and then underwrite family, friends, community members that are referred into these programs in order to pursue education pathways. And the frictionless portion of it is we're doing the curation of what education pathways ahead of time, and then we're also underwriting people to go through so that the cost is also not a barrier, and then adding student supports in order to move adults through this process. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, but again, we don't want the complexity to fall on the consumer, because that also creates a friction of them pursuing upskilling and education.
I just want to add a cautionary note, if I may, which is that I don't think it's the case that if higher education somehow miraculously overnight transforms into sort of skills or competency-based education and makes all skills and competencies somehow visible to employers, that's a game changer, because you need employers to be able to receive and understand those competencies. And right now, employers are not set up to do that at all. Their HRIS systems, applicant tracking systems, are fairly primitive in terms of the technologies they utilize. They're scanning keywords in resumes and mapping those keywords to the job descriptions. If you have sufficient match, then you make it through and you're actually seen by a human being. In order to affect this revolution, I mean, ultimately the degrees are a macro credential that we've relied on for centuries, because we haven't been able to sort of access the micro skill or micro competency level data. Even if higher ed somehow transforms, you still need employers to be able to understand these skills and competencies that these shorter term training programs are delivering, and we're still a very long way from that.
If I could just respond just real quickly to Ryan, I completely agree. And I think that one of the things that I would love to highlight about some of the work we're doing in Colorado is a partnership with Skillful Colorado and the Colorado Workforce Development Council. We just went, this project is relatively new, but what we're doing is we're getting subject matter expert and industry validated job profiles that are skills-based hiring profiles and have removed all of the educational requirements and that sort of thing, and are really focusing on the skills-based job profiles. What we're doing is we're laying that over our competencies throughout our system to see what courses are teaching to what competencies and what job profiles. I think the proof will be if employers are actually willing to shift practices and employ based on skills instead of on proxies of education using credentials and that sort of thing.
Great. Let's try to squeeze a few more questions in here. One question here, several employers have tuition reimbursement programs, which are often tied to credit-based programs and have grade requirements. Are there guides, or do you have advice for employers who are making, who might want to make adjustments to their employee engagement plans and fund non-credit short-term credentials or certificates? Ryan, have you seen any good examples, folks that aren't thinking about the entry-level jobs, but are also thinking about how they continue to reskill their existing workforce?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's, we're seeing a lot of attention being paid to that. I think that the challenge is that these are training or learning and development budgets, which when times get tough, companies slash. So, you know, I think we see a lot of grand pronouncements out of large enterprises. But, you know, the proof is in the pudding. And I think the pudding is, pudding is emptying out, unfortunately, as we see what most sort of training and L&D budgets look like over the coming year.
Bon?
You know, the most two important elements for your employees to take up on the offer of tuition reimbursement is it flexible and affordable? Are there flexible and affordable options? And flexible is pretty obvious, but on the affordable, what you know, the Aspen Institute found out is really that the cash flow that individuals have to put out in order to front tuition payment is actually a significant barrier for many. And so a best practice is to move from tuition reimbursement to actually tuition disbursement up front. And for one company, a manufacturing company, when the CEO started asking his employees, why aren't you taking advantage of this program, and learned that this cash flow is an issue, he jumped from roughly 60 takers to over 300 takers when he changed the nature of the tuition program from after the fact to being able to manage people's cash flow. So that's just an example of a good practice. And again, this is going to be a hard time on the economy, so I do hope employers don't retrench in terms of those benefits.
Great, thank you. Well, we are just wrapping up here at the time today. Thank you so much. We could go on and on, I think, on this topic. And thank you for just an engaged group. I'm watching the chat continue to blow up here. As always, we'll send through the recording and the deck that you presented today. For those of you joining us, you'll also get a survey. Strata is really seeking feedback on the kinds of topics and the experts that we're bringing into these conversations. So please feel free to take that and provide some advice for us. But thank you so much, Andrew, Ryan, Vaughn, Michael. Thank you for a great conversation, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks, so look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you to Strata for doing these. It's great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.